Hi, it's Hannah Mole here from the Rural Planning Co. Today I'm going to talk to you and give you a Class Q update, and those are all the things that we've learnt from having done lots of Class Qs over the last few years. Now this is actually a re-recording of a webinar that we did last night on Monday the 18th. Unfortunately, some of the audio didn't come out as well on the recording, so we just thought we'd record it again this morning and hopefully it will be clearer for you all to listen to. We also got asked lots and lots of questions on the webinar last night, so rather than bundling them all into one long video, we thought that we would do a separate video, which is a Q&A, and we will send that out to you all later in the week as well. So I'm going to run through this now. It's going to be exactly the same as last night, but hopefully it will be a little bit clearer for you. So this is our Class Q update, and this is what we're going to cover. Firstly, we're going to cover just a recap really of what Class Q is and what it allows. There are some size limitations that you need to know about, and then we're going to run through what the criteria are and whether your building would meet Class Q. There's a prior notification process, and that involves how you notify the local planning authority that you intend to undertake this type of development. What the main issues are, and those are the things that we come up against most frequently. And the main one of all is about the structure and the condition of the building. So we're going to spend some time focusing on that, and we've got some photographs to show you. I'm going to cover briefly what work you can and can't do to a building before you do a Class Q. There are some differences in local authorities, how they deal with Class Qs between local authorities. So we're going to just highlight that to you and what that means for you and which local authority you're in. I'm going to cover some interesting appeal decisions which highlight some things that are worth remembering when preparing a Class Q. And then we're going to finish up by talking about superseding a Class Q with a full planning application, and that could be making amendments to your current design, or it could possibly even be building a brand new plot and starting again. And there are pros and cons of both of those, so we will go through that as well. So it's useful just at the start to do a quick recap on what permitted development is. Now, most of the time in England, as indeed the other areas of the UK, but we're going to just refer to England today, most development requires planning permission. If you're going to build something or change the use of something or convert something, it generally requires actually getting express planning consent from the local authority. But in England, within the planning legislation, there is something called the General Permitted Development Order. So it's actually the GPDO, General Permitted Development Order, and that contains several classes of development which are permitted without actually getting planning consent, subject to that building or that holding meeting certain criteria. Now, one of those classes is called Class Q, and this is the change of use of an agricultural building and reasonably necessary operational development to a residential dwelling. So that means it's changing the use and any building works that need doing that are reasonably necessary into a residential dwelling. And Class Q allows for that without actually getting express planning consent. So what that means is that subject to you meeting the criteria, your building or your farm benefits from Class Q permitted development rights. They exist, they're hovering around now. You don't actually expressly need to go and get planning consent to change the use from your agricultural building to residential, so long as it meets the criteria. Now, as you'll hear from us, you still have to go through the prior notification process, so it still feels a little bit like a planning application, but there are subtle differences which can actually make this a really useful, valuable permitted development right for farmers to utilise. So what does Class Q allow and not allow? So as we've just described, we're talking about changing the use of a building and the building operations to allow the conversion to a residential unit. In order to facilitate that, you can undertake partial demolition. And through the Class Q, you can also change the use of a relatively small amount of land to curtilage, and curtilage is your garden and parking. Unfortunately, it's relatively limited as to the size that you can get into the curtilage, but we can always increase that through a planning application at a later point in time. What Class Q doesn't allow is any extension beyond the external dimensions of the building. So it's very limited that you have to keep the size exactly the same as the current dimensions of the building. So to the point at which you can't even put a chimney on, a flue on, a balcony or anything. That's not to say, again, that you can't do it via a planning application afterwards, but you can't do that through the Class Q process. The other thing that you can't do is you can't knock down and rebuild, again, through the Class Q. It's not to say that we can't do it, and I do actually cover this in the supersede section at the end, but through the Class Q, you have positively got to be shown to be converting the building, not knocking it down and replacing it. So we just wanted to run through the criteria. Now, this is the Class Q criteria. This is what the legislation sets out that your building and your holding have to meet in order to have Class Q potential and be Class Q-able. So as you'll see as we go through, some of these criteria are objective. So they're a yes or a no. You're in it or you're out of it. Unfortunately, probably too many for my liking, some of them are subjective, and that means that there's got to be a view taken on whether it meets this criteria. And of course, my view might be different to your view, that might be different to a planning officer's view. So it's obviously, that's really, I suppose, our job as a planning consultant, is to help guide you through those subjective criteria and making sure that we can position your building as best as we possibly can to be positively meeting the Class Q criteria. So to run through these, the first ones then in white, hopefully that these are the objective ones. So and so these are the ones which, unfortunately, if you're a no, then we can't do Class Q. It's pretty much just a no. So I'm afraid that to those of you over the borders, then this is a legislation, permitted development right, that only applies in England. You can't have used your agricultural permitted development rights in the last 10 years. So if you have done a 28-day notice on your farm in the last 10 years, then in theory, you no longer have Class Q rights. So they're all part of the permitted development, and the Part 6, which is your ag rights, affect your Class Q rights and vice versa. So if you have used one or the other, you lose the other for 10 years. Now, whilst this is objectively assessed, there are occasionally things that we can do with this. And I think one of the questions that we're going to cover in the Q&A is about what constitutes an agricultural unit, and we'll talk about that separately. And there are a couple of things that we can do in terms of, if you have done a 28-day notice and put up a shed under your permitted development rights, then sometimes we can do a retrospective planning application to regain your Class Q rights. So occasionally we can be a bit sneaky with that. So don't necessarily completely despair, but if you haven't used them, then much easier. I'm afraid that Class Q is not available in a national park, an AONB, conservation areas, the Broads, triple SIs, which is sites of special scientific interest, safety hazard areas and scheduled monuments. I'm sorry if you can't see that behind my head. Also, the building can't be listed, and it can't be a curtilage listed building either. The building must have been there for at least 10 years at the date of application. So as at today's date, in middle of July 2023, your building must have been present in July 2013 in order for it to be applicable for Class Q. Generally speaking, you can't be in a flood zone. This is one of the things that the local authority do go through and check in the prior notification process. So again, if you're out of a flood zone, then happy days. If you are in a flood zone, it still might be worth talking to us, because I have seen one or two appeal decisions where people have managed to overcome the flooding issue, but it can make life considerably more difficult. Quite a big one, which is that we have to be able to show that highways and access is safe and suitable. Now, for the vast majority, it's not an issue. If it is likely to be an issue, if you are objectively coming out of the access for your Class Q barn and you can't see left or right, and you know that it's a problem, then we should address it before you go in with a Class Q application. And whether that is we look for an alternative access, or we put an alternative agricultural access in prior to doing the Class Q, or whether we just go off and get some transport consultant input, there are ways to look at it and deal with it, but we have to do that sort of conscientiously and ahead of doing the application. Let's try and hide behind it, because that's something that will sort of come out and be assessed. One of the newer things that has come out under Class Q is that we have to be able to show that we can get adequate natural light to all of the habitable rooms. Now, again, that's a little bit of there's some sort of quirks in there in terms of which habitable rooms. For example, you don't need to in the downstairs bathroom, but you do need to in the kitchen and the bedroom and so on. So we just got to make sure that we can design the Class Q to make sure that we are ticking that box. So that's just really a sort of design thing that we have to go through. This is something that does get questioned quite a lot in Class Q. The building has to be an agricultural building on an agricultural unit. And of course, you could ask all day long what constitutes an agricultural building and what constitutes an agricultural unit. I am going to talk about that in another slide. And again, I think we'll probably cover off it in some more questions as well, because there were quite a few on that. So the next one is it an appropriate location in context of the remaining farm buildings? Is it in practical or an undesirable location? And that really relates to the sort of what else is going on in the farmyard. Is there still livestock? Is there still a large movement of heavy vehicles, etc., going outside the door? So we just got to address that. But again, talk to your planning consultant about it, because that's something that, generally speaking, we can take a view on as we go through the process. Again, something that comes up quite regularly is whether the design and external appearance of the barn is appropriate. And that is very subjective, because that's a planning officer deciding on whether they think that your design and external appearance is appropriate. So generally speaking, this is the difficulty, is that they want the less glazing. They don't want, generally, as a rule of thumb, loads and loads and loads of windows everywhere. But of course, we've still got to meet the adequate natural light. So there is a real balance to be had on this. Again, as a sort of rule of thumb and path of least resistance comment, if you can retain the existing materials for your Class Q, that helps as well. That seems to make it easier for them to go through. Now, if you've got some kind of old tin on the side and, it's really not something that you want to keep, yes, in theory, it can be reclad, so long as it doesn't go beyond the external dimensions. It might not be the path of least resistance to reclad it if you're substantially changing the materials, and it might be something that we decide that you actually apply for that change of cladding at a planning application, perhaps at a later stage. So again, some of the strategy and sort of lining your ducks up on this type of application is necessary. And then the final one, and this is a biggie, and I'm going to cover it in quite a lot of detail in this, because this is the one that I would say 95%, probably more, 95% of appeals are relating to this issue. And that is that the existing building must be capable of functioning as a dwelling. And I'm going to come on to that in a minute or two. So it's useful to know what size dwellings you can have. So the legislation refers to two different size dwellings, smaller dwelling houses being up to 100 square metres and larger being over 100 square metres. You can have up to 5 smaller dwelling houses as long as each of them are less than 100 square metres, and you can have up to 3 larger dwelling houses as long as the total area converted for those 3 larger in total doesn't exceed 465 square metres. Now, this is on one agricultural unit, what we're talking about here. You can combine the two to have a maximum of 5 units. So you could have 3 large and 2 small. You could have two large, 3 small. There's depending on obviously the size of your building and how much capacity you've got for space. So when we're talking about this, it's important to note that we're talking about floor space. So that's ground floor and first floor. We're not talking about footprint here. So it's a combined ground and first, and that is the total floor space. If you wanted to max out on floor space, this is the absolute maximum combination you can have. So one large dwelling at 465 and four smaller dwelling houses at 100. And that obviously gives you 465 plus 400. And so the absolute maximum floor space under Class Q you can have is 865. But what I would say is that obviously when you're designing these houses and the configuration, you've really got to have in mind what you're looking to do next with them. So if you are just looking for one large house for yourself, then you decide on how big you want that to be, obviously within the parameters of what size building you've got. If you are looking to get the maximum with a view to superseding it and selling it off as a small building site, then we'd probably try to go for an even amount of sort of floor areas, and you'd probably go for something like 2 or 3 large ones and a couple of small ones where they're going to be more evenly sized at the end, but also trying to max out on floor space as well. And in some instances, we quite commonly come up to kind of somewhere between 650 and 750 square meters on those types of schemes. So you need to have a think about what you want out at the end of it, and so what size you want to go for. As we mentioned at the start, there is a prior notification process. So we're not expressly seeking planning consent, but what we do have to do, as instructed by the legislation, is we need to notify the council that you intend to exercise your permitted development rights. So we're saying we intend to undertake a Class Q. Here is how I meet the criteria. I want you, local authority, to assess it, and obviously I want you to approve it, but obviously that is the process that we have to go through. So we are notifying them that we intend to undertake this development, and we have to show how we meet the criteria. Now, to all intents and purposes, when we're going through this process, it feels quite a lot like a planning application. So there's no sort of pretending otherwise, it still feels much the same. Technically, it is slightly different, and therefore, in terms of both the application and then, if necessary, an appeal process, it is considered a light touch process where really the local authority can only consider the criteria within the Class Q legislation. They can't really be thinking about the principle of whether the location, whether they would ordinarily give planning for a house in this location and so on. So the process is like a planning application forms. We've got to send in full drawings. So that's existing drawings and proposed drawings. That's elevations, that's the sides and the floor plans. In most situations, we'd be wanting to submit a structural survey. If you have got an absolutely outstanding kind of brick barn that's in perfect condition, you might not need it. But in most circumstances, we'd be submitting a structural survey, and that is to show that the building is structurally sound and capable of being converted. For the reasons outlined, and I'll come on to again, is we've got to be able to show that this building is truly going to be converted and not rebuilt. So in quite a lot of situations, we spend time in putting together a construction method statement or a description of how the conversion is going to be undertaken. So what the materials are going to be used, what's going to be retained, where the insulation's going, what development is happening on the inside, and so on. In most situations, you'll probably need to submit the community infrastructure levy forms. There might be other reports. We might have to do ecology reports, but again, line your ducks up, get some advice from a planning consultant. It's one of those things, you don't want to spend money willy-nilly if it's not necessary on surveys, but equally you don't want to come unstuck on something you should have done and you otherwise fail your Class Q because you should have done it. So a little bit of common sense there. And then we also put in a planning statement, which is how we meet the criteria that I've just shown you on the previous slide. And the council have got 56 days from the date that they receive it in order for them to make a decision. So generally speaking, you don't want to be in the position where they don't make a decision. You really do need a piece of paper. So we do push for that decision within the 56 days. It isn't like an ag building where the 28-day runs over and so just let's go and build it. You really do need a piece of paper for this one. So moving on then, so we just wanted to cover in a little bit more detail some of the things that come up in sort of quite frequently. And this is the discussion about it being an agricultural building on an agricultural unit. So I'll cover the first part of that. We need to be able to show that this building that we're looking to Class Q was in agriculture in 2013, or 10 years, if you're watching this sometime in the future, 10 years before the date of application, it needs to have been in agricultural use. And it also needs to be in agricultural use at the date of application. Now, in theory, there is, what we're talking about is the lawful use. So the lawful use needs to be agriculture. If you have applied for planning permission at some point in the interim for storage, domestic use, equestrian use, and you have started using it for those other uses, it now can be tricky to come back from that. In theory, you possibly could put the building back to agriculture because it's a null use, it's a base use that you don't need to get permission to come back from it. But I think you probably might have a fight on your hands. But again, worth chatting to us, because if the use was brief between 2013 and today's date, if the use was brief, then it still might be something that is worth looking at. So I wouldn't count it out entirely. But what you do want to make sure is that when you're applying for your Class Q, because a planning officer will come out, you want it to look and make sure that it fully looks like an agricultural building, because the point is, this one on the right hand side that's just been used for a bit of storage, they cleared the house out, it's been used for a bit of storage, it really is still an agricultural building. Its lawful use is still agriculture, but because it's just got some stuff in it, the planning officer is likely to come out and question the lawful use of the building. So again, just move it out before we apply for planning. Path of least resistance, don't make it a thing. So make sure that you know, to the naked eye, when you come out, any ordinary person would look at this and think, this is an agricultural building, I'm not questioning it. The second part of this second part is the agricultural unit. Now, an agricultural unit, there is some case law on what constitutes an agricultural unit. The general description is that it is all of your farming unit that is run together. But my view is that I think we can differentiate between planning units. So and again, this is where you need to take some advice really. Arguably, and perhaps some local authorities would argue that if, say, for example, you had got one farming business but 3 farmyards, they might argue that all of those 3 farmyards are your agricultural unit. I think that there's argument to say they're 3 separate planning units, and we have been successful in doing that in some situations, is arguing that they're separate agricultural units. So again, get the advice. But obviously the objective really is to max out on your Class Q if you can. So if we can get them as separate units, then happy days. But take some advice is the answer on that. So this is the biggie, and so this is the one that I want to spend some time on. Now, this is the most sort of subjective part of the whole Class Q really. The legislation allows for you to change the use, and so changing the use is sort of relatively park that's okay, but it also allows for the building operations reasonably necessary for this building to function as a dwelling house. Now, of course, reasonably necessary is 2 very woolly words that everybody will interpret differently. The legislation expressly sets out that we can install or replace windows, doors, roofs, exterior walls, and you can put your utilities in, and you can do partial demolition. But if you were to do all of those things, if you were to install or replace all the windows, all the doors, the roof, and all the walls, you've effectively rebuilt your barn, and there is nothing left of the original barn. So what we're talking about is a sort of matter of fact and degree on each application. So you can do some of it, but you can't do all of it. And that is where this grey area comes in, and why all of these appeals come about for, you know, which are suitable, and, you know, how much work can be done. And of course, you know, different people, me as a consultant, a planning officer, an appeal inspector, we would all have a slightly different view on what is reasonably necessary. So there has been lots and lots of appeals and some case law on this matter. Now, when Class Q first came out a number of years ago, actually it was the legislation basically said that as long as the building must be structurally sound and capable of conversion. And at that point, there was even some where they were just a Dutch barn with no sides going through. It was, people were getting sort of, you know, just, and it was, they were being entirely rebuilt, really, those buildings. So what happened, there was a course that, there was a case that went all the way through to the Court of Appeal, or the High Court, one or the other, and that is called the Hibbett case. And the Hibbett case has now become very widely recognised case law about this point of what is reasonably necessary. And the government actually then issued some more guidance trying to sort of reduce the woolliness of what this constitutes. And you can find that guidance online. There is still quite a range, so it has reduced it a little bit, and now we're working to the Hibbett rules. And what the Hibbett rules basically set out to us is that we have to be able to demonstrate that this Class Q is a conversion, and that's the thing that you need to remember, and objectively look at your barn and decide. So we need to be able to show that your building is capable of conversion without substantial rebuild and without significant new structural elements. And so this is why you have to really carefully position and present your Class Q, because you've got to be able to show that it's this conversion. If it looks like it's too much rebuild, then it will fail the Class Q. So I want to give you, so every single barn we have to take on its merits, every single building. So I can't advise and give you definitive yes and no's. Every barn is different. I can give you some rules of thumb today, which you might find useful. And so I've got some photographs to try and demonstrate that. So here, to my mind, we've got a definite yes and a definite no. And so this is the start of the spectrum. The Dutch barn, so yes, it's got a frame, but you would have to install all of the walls, all of the windows, all of the doors, and I don't know about the condition, but there's a chance that you might have to replace the roof. Okay, so that is a no. That would constitute a complete new build effectively. The only thing that you're keeping here is 10 steel uprights. So basically, I would say that Dutch barn, that does not meet the Hibbett test. That's a no. The breeze block building on the other side, that's completely enclosed. You've got good substantial, that building's actually got a good concrete floor in as well. So it's single story, which means that the breeze blocks that are there, you can keep those, you can convert from that. You could take off that tin and you could replace that with some lightweight panel type of things on top of it. The roof is good enough to keep, and then really all you're doing on that barn is you might replace the cladding, that tin cladding, but really you're just installing the utilities, the doors and the windows. On the two long sides, it's actually got doors on the two short ends anyway, so that is a clear conversion. You know, you feel comfortable that that building can comfortably be converted. Now, there are three elements really when we're talking about the sort of building operations. The first thing to consider is the frame, and these are my rules of thumb for you. If it's a steel frame like on the left, that's generally a good thing. So generally steel obviously has a long lifespan. It's something that you know, is built for the and capable of taking large loads, weighting, generally doesn't corrode. The only exception to that is that occasionally in the bottom of sort of cattle sheds, livestock buildings, if the steel frames has gone straight into the ground and hasn't been protected by concrete or something, occasionally like the ammonia and cattle manure and whatnot can rot around the bottom. So occasionally we see that, and sometimes there is some repair work that might need to be done in the same way as you would repair it as use as an agricultural building. and you might choose to do that repair work whilst it's still an agricultural building around the base of those posts. The middle one, ignoring the stables in there, but the middle one you can see is a concrete shed. Also, generally speaking, that is structurally sound and can also take loading. Now, the one on the right hand side is a timber pole barn, and as a rule, this is a no. So timber, unfortunately, doesn't have a long lifespan, especially where it's gone straight into the soil. It rots eventually. It doesn't have enough longevity. And generally speaking, in timber barns, pole barns, there is very little in there that you can reuse. So if you're looking objectively, you're not converting a timber barn. There isn't enough of there in there that is structurally sound. It is, you'd have to effectively rebuild that. So that's the frame. So steel, concrete, good. Unless the timber is in exceptional condition, normally timber is difficult to get through. So the next element to consider is the walls. Basically being more enclosed, the better, again, as a rule of thumb. So the enclosures, ideally, we like to see some form of brickwork or concrete around the base. That is our preference, because again, you can convert from that. So some sort of breeze block concrete panels around the base with either Yorkshire boarding, tin cladding, fibre cement around the above the and up to the eaves. That's also fine, and we've got lots of those through. Where it hasn't got any cladding, or it's sort of an alternative, that's not impossible, but we're sort of getting into slightly trickier realms here. How are we going to convert this? It has still got some base, so again, that's not impossible. If it didn't have that little breeze block wall on the bottom and just had cattle barriers, feed barriers, that would be then quite difficult, because you'd be having to install those new structural walls. Now, in terms of quantity, we certainly ideally would like sort of over 50% of the building enclosed. If you have one short or one long side open, that's generally okay. We can cover that off. Sometimes even two sides, but in an ideal world, we'd want to see at least two, if not three sides enclosed. So just covering off on the third structural element, which is the roof. Now, again, looking at that top one, you've got a steel frame with either timber or steel purlins, which is great. That's really sound, and we can certainly show and evidence that that is suitable for conversion. You see quite regularly these kind of the one on the bottom, these A-frames, or the roof, the roll top ones in Dutch barns. They're much more sort of smaller pieces of metal in there, and so those can be difficult to establish as to whether they can take a load, because obviously in the roof you've got to either replace the roof, or you certainly got to add insulation and things into the roof. So you've got to be able to establish whether those lighter weight ones can take the load. So that's where your structural surveyor comes in and advises from the outset. And if I was going out to look at a barn like this, that's probably the first thing I would do, is say, let's get the structural guy out here. We'll have a look at it, see what the loads are looking like, and we'll take advice from them in the first instance, rather than sort of spending the money to go through the process to only find that out later down the line. And then if you have just got sort of, slightly ad hoc built timber buildings, like this one on the right, where it is, very just sort of put together, it's bits of timber, the roof is leaking, the timber's fairly rotten, there's no concrete floor. Concrete floor, by the way, isn't essential, but it can help. And that's just been put together and, with bits of tin. That's going to be a no. This barn is was one that went through, and this was a sort of like a sort of 50-50 for me. This actually was refused at application, but went through at appeal. As you can see, it's got the concrete to three sides, and timber cladding above that, Yorkshire boarding above that, but it was open on that long side, no concrete floor. So that was a bit 50-50, but that did go through at appeal. This is one, again, this is a slightly bigger picture of the building I've just shown you. I think this is one that, this one hasn't actually gone to application yet, but I think this is one that we will be doing. It's got enough in there, I think, to sort of make a case for being a conversion with that big breeze block wall. We've just got to get the structural surveyor out there to look at that roof, but there's enough in there to convert that building. But again, that's not a super straightforward. Again, I'd put that at a sort of 50-50 maybe. This one is an application that we're currently doing, and we have decided to go forward with this one. It's a single story, so actually we can show that the load, the sort of weight that's got to go on these breeze block walls is not great. It's got breeze blocks behind the camera as well, all down that one side to part way and all across the back. And on the left hand side, where the feed barriers are, that has got a low breeze block. So actually, on balance, I think we can show on this one through a construction method statement that if we're using lightweight panels for enclosing, and also quite a lot of that is obviously going to be windows and glazing and things anyway, that is a true conversion. Again, we've got a concrete floor in here. So really, I suppose what I'm trying to get across is you've got to balance all of the elements. If you have got a concrete floor but a poorer walls, we might be okay because the concrete could take improving the structure of the walls. If you've got a great roof but no concrete floor, that might still be okay. It's about taking all of them in balance, I suppose, and you've got to assess all of them together as to how much is rebuild, how much is conversion. So we're starting to get into the realms of, reasonably straightforward Class Qs here, where you've got lots of breeze blocks. All you've got to do is knock some holes in for windows and doors. You put all your insulation on the inside and so on. So again, I would like to think that this is reasonably straightforward for Class Q. Yes, same again, really. Yes, we would have to block up the front, and I think you would also have to replace the roof on this one. So this one again is not definitely straightforward. You'd want to replace the roof with something that is okay, and then I think probably what you'd want to demonstrate in this one is that anything that you were doing along the front to enclose the building is probably hanging off the steel frame rather than wanting to put in new structural elements on the front, sort of building in foundations on the front. So I would try and use the existing frame to hang the, whatever sort of either panels as best you can, or glazing. You might have to put a bit of foundations in there, but try and keep that to a minimum. So again, taking all those things into account, this is one that I would recommend for a Class Q, but you just got to be careful to really try to demonstrate to the council that it's not too much rebuild. We are reusing the steel posts, we're reusing all of that breeze block that's around on three sides, with just replacing the roof materials. Here's a demonstration. We quite often look at some old poultry buildings, and here's two different ones, although the photo on the right isn't great. The one on the left, good condition, they've kept that really tidy and up together. And so that is something that, even though poultry buildings in some instances don't lend themselves to Class Q, this one I think probably could or would. The one on the right, unfortunately, is almost timber all the way through it. There's a few sort of steels supporting it, but there's no real sides to it. The roof would almost have to be completely replaced, and there's not enough in the main walls really to demonstrate, in my opinion, a conversion. So again, each one on its facts and on its own merits, I suppose. But poultry buildings, as a rule, can be tricky to get through because, of course, they were made out of timber construction. The older poultry buildings. But again, look at each one. These are good buildings. Happy with these. All suitable, sound, capable of conversion. So I would look at most of these and just give them a thumbs up, providing they meet the other criteria I'm just talking about from a structural perspective. So just to move along from that part, we get asked quite frequently, how much work can you do on a building before you apply for Class Q? And now this one's quite a sensitive one, and again, you've got to take each one on its facts and merits. And there is an element of people do some work, and then they go in for the Class Q and it's all fine. But also you must be aware of the risks of doing work pre the Class Q. Now, the first thing to say is that anything inside a building doesn't constitute development. So that doesn't require planning. So you can do work on the inside of a building, for example, disregarding Class Q for a minute, but if you had got an agricultural building that was tin on the outside and you wanted to change the use of that to a grain store, and if you wanted to put concrete panelling or breeze blocks on the inside of that building to use it as a grain store to push up against, then you can do that and it doesn't require planning consent. So obviously you can sort of, make amendments to your agricultural building without anything on the inside, without actually getting planning consent. So you can do that anyway. And again, also disregarding Class Q for now, just thinking about your base ag building, you can repair and maintain it, of course. So if it's got roof sheets that need repair, do that. If it's something that, we talked about the corrosion at the bottom of a steel frame building, then that might be something that you want to do anyway. Disregard, regardless of whether you're going to apply for Class Q, make those repairs to your agricultural building, keep them in good order. If you ever then subsequently want to do your Class Q, it's also there and useful for it. But maintaining and repairing your building is something that you can do as the sort of ordinary part of, just looking after your buildings. But be careful of making any significant exterior or external changes. So repairing a sheet is fine. Recladding a whole building is not fine. You've got to be careful, because if you start to rebuild or replace exterior walls, so now I'm talking about exterior, not internal, exterior. If you start to replace or rebuild exterior walls, that would either constitute that it needs planning, or it possibly even might constitute that you've used your Part 6 agricultural permitted development rights, which obviously then scuppers your Class Q. So this is a sort of slightly useful explanation. This is a building in Derbyshire that we found through an appeal decision. It was a dilapidated building. I've not got a photo of it before. The applicants have actually applied for planning to reclad it, and then they obviously subsequently applied for the Class Q. The appeal inspector concluded that they had effectively done so much work that they had rebuilt the barn in 2020. So there was photographs online of what it looked like before they rebuilt the barn. They had applied for it to be reclad, but effectively put so much new material in there, it was effectively a new barn. So the appeal inspector said, actually, that hasn't come into agricultural use. The barn that stands there today hasn't come into agricultural use until 2020, and therefore it fails the 10-year rule. So again, all of this is on fact and degree. I just want you to be aware of doing work to external walls, which might then negatively affect what you do, what you can do under Class Q in the future. Next, I wanted to cover some appeals that we've come across, and they just kind of highlight some of the things that we've got to remember as we go through Class Qs. So I think I've mentioned it before, almost all of the appeals that you see on Class Qs relate to that structural issue. So it's where the applicant has put forward works that the planning officer thinks are more than reasonably necessary, and they disagree on that, and so off it goes to the inspectorate to decide. There are a few other things which come up at appeal, and I've just got half a dozen of them to whiz through and highlight to you. So this is one which relates to ecology, and this was in Shropshire. The applicants for a Class Q were proposing to remove some tall vegetation and some grassland around where the parking and the access route into the Class Q barn was going to be. Now, in this situation, it was deemed that the pond had excellent suitability for great crested newts. No survey had actually been done. There was no evidence of actual newts there. It was just suitable habitat. And so the local authority refused it because the applicants had not provided a eco survey, and the planning inspector upheld it and basically just said that we don't have the information in front of us, so we can't approve it. We could be damaging that sort of species habitat. So the takeaway from this is that if it is something which, again, objectively look around, if you've got your pond near, if you're near woods and there could be bats, And certainly if there is anything that is in the barn itself, then you're best getting an eco survey. And yes, that's just get it, because then it's ticked off that this situation, they must have spent several £1000s on the whole application, and it was refused because they hadn't got an ecological survey. So so yes, just better going off and getting that. The next one is in Buckinghamshire. The council refused this application because the applicants had proposed to put solar panels on the roof and an air source heat pump next to the building. Now, obviously, all sort of, very good and, desirable to use renewable technology. But of course, in terms of the actual Class Q, it extended the exterior dimensions of the building, and therefore, just as a point blank, failed the criteria of Class Q. Regardless of whether putting those solar panels and air source is a good thing, it just failed the Class Q. So don't include that on your Class Q application. You can always go in for a planning application afterwards if you want to do those things. So this is one where the council incorrectly determined a Class Q application, and it was basically, as you can see where the red line is, it wasn't far away from other buildings, and what the council said was that it was not sustainable. It was locationally unsustainable. Now, this is something that the government have expressly in their planning guidance said that the councils can't take into account. So where it is a location that ordinarily the councils wouldn't grant permission for a residential unit, that doesn't apply to Class Qs. And the appeal inspector in this one actually gave a few examples of what impractical or undesirable might mean, and it is not sustainable location. So impractical could mean the lack of road access or power source. You could argue that power source is overcomable in other ways, but a road access could be something like, being 2.5 miles up a long track or something, with no turning or, pulling in. That might be impractical. Undesirable might be next to intensive livestock buildings, or a very, very busy farmyard, or part of a building, converting part of a building where the other part continues to be an agricultural use, for example. So again, there's some level of interpretation in these words. So just ask somebody what they think, somebody that's done lots of Class Qs, and they should be able to give you a view on whether it might be considered undesirable or impractical. This is a slightly controversial appeal decision. Heritage criteria and impact on heritage assets is not actually a criteria of Class Q. Yes, it expressly sets out that we can't do Class Q on listed buildings or curtilage listed buildings, but it's something that we don't generally have to assess the impact on listed buildings. This was taken differently, and I don't know if you can see it, but the building on the far left is a building, a grade 2, I think, listed house called Liberty Hall, and the sort of building more to the bottom was the barn. And what the local authority and ultimately the appeal inspector agreed, that the proposed design of the Class Q would be harmful to the setting of the listed building. Now, this isn't something I've really particularly seen in Class Qs before, and it did make me just sort of sit up and think, is it something we need to be thinking about? But I actually perhaps disagree with how this was dealt with, but who am I to say? But just something that we need to be aware of, perhaps. This poor chap here was in Mid Sussex Local Authority, and they had granted in 2019 a Class Q on this building. During the course of building the Class Q, and I quote, the building contractor inadvertently removed parts of the frame. Basically, they knocked it down to start again. The applicant, I say that, they might not have knocked it down to start again. They took away quite a substantial part of the frame anyway. The applicants proceeded to start rebuilding it, but presumably had enforcement action and from the local authority, who obviously said, you've rebuilt it, you're not converting it. So the applicants made a retrospective application for an identical building to the Class Q. It's going to end up looking exactly the same as what had previously been granted, but the local authority and the appeal inspector said, no, you're not converting the building, and you're rebuilding a new building in this location where we wouldn't ordinarily support a new build in this location, so you can't have it. So unfortunately for them, I haven't heard if they've taken it any further or not, but that was going to be a no, and they were already partway through rebuilding it. So the takeaway from that, and this is a biggie, is convert it and make sure you are converting it, because if anybody rocked up at the wrong time when you had taken down the frame, you're left with nothing. You don't even have a barn anymore. So, and there have been a few appeal cases of that happening. So please make sure that you can show that you're converting it and don't knock down a Class Q. If you want to knock it down and start again, you must do a planning application, and that's what I'm going to talk about in a moment, but don't try and do it under the Class Q. There are quite a lot of differences in how local authorities deal with Class Qs. Now, Class Q applies to England, and in an ideal world, it would be determined the same in every local authority in England. But as you saw from the criteria in the first instance, you know, that long list of criteria, all the white ones are objective, they're fine, yes or no, but you've got still this long list of subjective ones. And of course, as I've described a few times, we all have different opinion about how to interpret wording and, you know, what is reasonably necessary. So some local authorities, I don't think, unfortunately, are still interpreting the legislation correctly. So just to give you a local example around us in Worcestershire, we have Wychavon and Wyre Forest. Both of those are good local authorities to deal with, and they approve over 80% of their Class Qs. Neighbouring Malvern Hills has, and this is in the year to September 22, only approved 24% of those, and they were almost all brick barns. So anything modern steel frame was a no. And of course the problem with this is that we go to see a client with, in theory, a barn that is Class Q-able in Malvern Hills, and we are having to say to them, yes, we can do your Class Q, but we're going to have to go to appeal on this, and so it's X thousand more in order for us to do that. Which obviously doesn't really seem fair. So we have taken it up using Malvern Hills as the example. There are others, I'm not just picking on Malvern Hills, but we have taken it up with them and tried to sort of evidence this. And I think there are some movements being made now, but it is useful to highlight just how inconsistent it can be, and it can feel like a bit of a postcode lottery, unfortunately. I do have a list of the whole of the England local authorities up to the same date, up to September 22. So if anybody wants to know what theirs is, then just email us and ask. So this is a sort of fun bit to add on the end, I suppose. So let's say we've gone through all the criteria, you've gone through your prior notification process, and now you have banked your Class Q, whether it's 1, 2, 3 buildings. You can make that conversion, and you can do that because you've got your Class Q, you've got your piece of paper, and you can do that. So long as you don't knock it down and you are converting it, you can do that building. So you can convert that building. But as we've discussed, there are a few things where Class Q are really limited. And so what you might choose to do is actually change your Class Q to a planning application, basically submit a planning application instead of your Class Q. So you've done the Class Q, you follow it up with a planning application that would effectively supersede the Class Q. And there are a few reasons that you might do that. You could amend the design, you could change the cladding, you could put some external dimensions additions on. So you wouldn't necessarily go and try and apply for more floor area under that, but you would or could potentially put your flue in, your chimney in, a balcony. You could perhaps maybe sort of carve a bit out of your building. You know, there's a few different sort of external things that you might choose to do from a design point of view. When you're doing a Class Q, for the reasons that we've talked about, you have got to be really careful to convert it as per the Class Q. You really can't vary from those plans that you've got approved. Once you're into a planning application though, if you're halfway through building it and you decide that I would like to move a window there or a wall there, it's much easier to make those amendments through what's called either a minor modification or a Section 73 application when you're in process of building it. So it's much easier to make amendments to a planning application than a Class Q. And then lastly, strangely, a Class Q permission only gives you 3 years to complete the build. It has to be completed within 3 years. Under a planning application, you only have to start it or implement it with 3 years. And of course, that's infinitely more flexible and gives you lots more options and time to complete your build. So there are several reasons why, even if you want to still convert your barn and still do it very similar to your Class Q, there are several reasons why you might choose to upgrade it or supersede it with a planning application. There is one downside to this that we've come across, which is where you change it to a planning application, some of the local authorities are insisting that you have to pay an affordable housing contribution at that point, which can be a few £1,000s, and they're basically just using it as an opportunity to get that. So that is the downside in some authorities, but depending on how much it is, I think in a lot of instances, if this is going to be a house for you to live in forever, it's worth spending a few £1,000s to get the design that you want. Equally, if this is 3 or 4 or 5 dwellings, and that we can now convert these into either new builds or change the design, you're significantly adding value to that, so as that you can make that a much more valuable plot to sell off and dispose of. So those are the reasons why you might change or amend an application, do a planning application to amend a Class Q. But even more excitingly, we can also now use what's called the fallback position of the Class Q to apply for a brand new build instead of the Class Q itself. So knock it down and apply for a Class Q under a full planning application. So you've banked the Class Q, now we apply to build a new house instead. And so that's what I'm going to talk through with you very quickly now. So this is the scenario, and this is a real life example, and I'll give you some photos in a minute. And this was actually the first one that we did for a client of these supersedes. So we had achieved a Class Q in a steel frame building for 3 dwellings. And as you can see, we'd had to keep the design very, very basic and functional. Really wasn't going to be very pretty. But because it met the Class Q legislation, we achieved that. So we got approval for the Class Q. And in this situation, that is what we're allowed to do. So in this location, I can't remember the precise size of this, but let's say 600 square metres, 3 residential dwellings in this field in Worcestershire. And that is, we're allowed to build that because we've got the Class Q in place. He could have started that the day after. So what we do at this point, and so what that gives us is what's called this fallback position. And this came about because of a case called the Mansell case a few years ago. And this, again, went through the courts, and it was established, the principle of this was established, and it's called fallback principle, where what you could otherwise do under Class Q in this situation, what you could otherwise do, and then it means that you can effectively provide an alternative to what you could otherwise already do to your fallback. So we go back to the local planning authority and we provide them with this alternative. So we still end up with 3 dwellings, 600 square metres of floor space in a same or similar location, but we offer betterment or planning gain to the local authority. And that could be in terms of better design, better materials, something that looks more character appropriate to the area, improved quality in the long term, energy efficiency, and or improved layout and siting. So we can meet all of those, some or all of those betterments. Then you're effectively saying we're still going to end up with the same thing, and now we've got option A or option B, and one is better. And so actually, why don't you let us have a new build, because you're gaining out of this option B. So this, you don't need to read it all, but this was what the planning officer said about this one. And you can just kind of pick out a few things, but it's basically setting out that, that there's more to it than this, but that this is a simpler, they're a better design. it would reduce the massing from what is otherwise a bulky building. The materials would be better, and that it would be a substantial visual improvement that would reflect the local character and sit better in the landscape. So that's what we're aiming for. So if we think that we can provide that with a new build, then we stand a good chance and prospect of success. So to give you, to follow on with this example, this was the original building that we got the Class Q for. You've already seen the drawings, so not very inspiring. And this is what we got permission for instead. So we applied for a house and 2 farm workers' cottages in a semi-detached configuration. And as you can see, it is substantially different, like completely different. It's not, doesn't even look like a barn anymore. We have just applied for a house, and a much nicer house at that. So really, the choice is what, you know, you always can think about it in terms of what do we want, what does it want to look like, or what will it look like in 20 years or 100 years? Would I rather look at this house or 3 of those very oddly configured terraced houses in a steel frame? And I know what I prefer, which is this. And of course, the planning officer came to the same conclusion. So yes, where we can show planning betterment, planning gain against any perceived harm of a supersede planning application, we can now ordinarily be successful with these. So again, it takes a lot of thinking about this. It's not a cheap exercise to go through this, but think about what the values are worth and what this is worth to you if you want to live in them in the long term. So superseding a Class Q is something to get excited about and can make quite a big difference. I've got just another couple of examples. This had a Class Q on it. This was the building. We didn't do the Class Q on this. We came to it afterwards. This is the Class Q that had been achieved by the applicant. Three dwellings in this sort of configuration. And so we just asked for 2 nice houses instead. And again, the local authority were happy with that. I think they look better. You know, what would you rather sit there in that landscape? So you could do that Class Q tomorrow. I'd rather have these houses. This is one we're just about to submit, so I hope I'm not jinxing it. But so we've got a Class Q on this. This is what it's going to look like. We sort of purposefully actually kept that reasonably sort of, you know, minimal in terms of, you know, just fairly basic in terms of the design. Now, this is an area in Worcestershire where it's a big sort of oak frame area, very traditional character. So we are going to apply for this house instead. Now, even if we don't get precisely this one, we'll get something fairly similar, I think. So it is a sort of part oak frame house. We're going to have, there's going to be brick and wooden cladding with tiled roof. The size of the house will be exactly the same. The square footage is the same. It is a little bit taller, but it's in the same location, although we have slightly reorientated it just for sort of sun and energy efficiency and so on, and just for it generally looking nicer in the sort of sighting in the yard area. So it still ends up as being a single dwelling in the same location of the same square footage. But what would you rather have? Would you rather have this that looks like this? It's not awful, but it's not beautiful, probably depends on what your taste is, but or would you have this? And so that's what we're going to these local planning officers now with is we offer you an alternative B. We think there is betterment in this, and can we knock down the Class Q and can we have a new build instead? So that is the end of our presentation. How we can help you. So we're obviously a specialist planning consultancy in all things rural, and Class Qs are certainly something that we do a lot of. If you have got a Class Q, if you're listening to this and you've got a Class Q building and you are sort of thinking that you might like to go down these lines, and I would encourage you to do your own research first, check the designations and so on, and you can go onto a website called Magic Maps, and you can do all of that yourself, obviously without paying anybody to start off with. If you would like us to have a 2-minute glance at some photographs and give you a rough yay or nay on the structure, photographs, or sometimes it's kind of middling, then send them in, we can have a quick look. If you would like a consultant review, so something a bit more thorough, and what we can do with that is a basic check of whether you meet the criteria, a bit of initial advice on the condition and structure of the building, sort of via photographs, and then we can have a telephone conversation with you to offer some of that strategic advice about how to take your application forwards. Ordinarily, we charge between £300 and £450 for those, but if you have watched this webinar and instruct us before the end of July, then we can complete this for you for £150. After that, we will revert back to, which is still, we think, a fair price, the £300 figure. It's useful to get that information at the start. If we have to turn around and say, no, you're not going to be able to get it, you've only spent £150 or £300. If it is something that we advise that you should be able to go forward with a Class Q, well, we've already done that portion of the work, and you've got a fair way, a sort of stepping stone to moving along with your application. So this is us. We do agricultural, equestrian, rural business and residential applications of all sorts. We do strategy, advice, the applications themselves, appeals if we have to, but we cover we cover all of England, and we do go into Wales a bit as well, but we have a very high success rate. We're very proud of what we do. We've got a team of 16 or 17 of us currently, with some very experienced planning consultants, and we're just nice people to deal with, we like to think. So if you've got anything that you'd like to run past us, we're very happy to help. I'm hugely passionate about agriculture and farming, and this is why we do what we do, which is to help farmers grow their businesses and enjoy living and working on a farm. So please come and get in touch with us, and thank you for listening.